you did a lovely job of introducing me. I'm Ilze Baron. I'm from the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, and we are representing the Green Industries desk there. The Green Industries desk hasn't existed for very long. It actually has a history that is very much aligned with the NCPC. And one of our main duties is the oversight of this program, and we are so very proud of its achievements in the 20 years that it's existed. So I'm here to provide you an overview of both the government perspective and then also the business imperative for gender mainstreaming. So let's begin with the government side. So the National Development Plan of 2030 envisions South Africa in which the transformation of the economy should involve the active participation and empowerment of women. The role of women as leaders, particularly, is highlighted in this plan in all sectors of society, and it should be actively supported according to the policy. In recent years, to complement the vision of 2030, a range of policies has been introduced in order to give implementation body to the policy intention, and some of those would be the Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality Policy, the policy framework, the Department of Environment at the time, strategy toward gender mainstreaming, and of course the various policy perspectives and targets in the National Development Plan. In terms of the NDP, gender equality was highlighted as a critical factor and considered in the context of transformation. So that's also considered together with triple BEE, and that's often how it appears in the indicators. But success has been limited. I think we can all agree on that. In terms of the statistics, Stats SA inequality trends, which they produced in 2019, showed that women earned on average 30% less than men for the same jobs in the same sectors, and that's even benchmarked. And the outcomes were largely attributed to the persistence of gendered barriers, even though the report didn't go into detail, and a lack of participation of women in labor and entrepreneurial markets. And I would add to that it also highlighted that there was an abundance of participation of women in the informal side of the economy, but because that can't really be measured by Stats SA, it couldn't be put into that report. So it's anecdotal but not measured, doesn't appear on the tax records, doesn't appear on the Department of Labor records. So there is a big data problem there with women in the informal sector. In terms of leadership, so that was looking at women at a sort of worker level in terms of leadership and upper echelons of management and at board level. The leadership in the formal economy, it was further reported that in terms of the primary challenge of representation, especially on boards, women make up less than 1/5 of the JSE executive director population, including CEOs and CFOs, and the lack of representation is even more marked at CEO level, where it was at just 6% in 2019. Dovetailing with this was a need for equal representation of women and society at large. And I think what was clear from that report, and maybe we've made some strides in the 3 years that have followed, but there's need for systemic change. Another systemic change that I deal with, certainly in my work in green industries, is climate change and the need to adapt to sustainable production modalities. So if we just take a view of that, globally, currently the world consumes twice as much resources, consumes resources at twice the speed that we can replenish them. Every year, more than 100 billion tons of raw materials into the global economy. The waste from this activity leaks into the environment. It pollutes our air, our water resources, and even the soil that we need to cultivate further crops in. The emissions of greenhouse gases are leading to rising atmospheric temperatures and resource depletion, and loss of biodiversity is leading to degradation of the natural environment that all humans depend on to thrive and survive. Going back to a more localized view, we know we live in South Africa. We function here on coal-fired electricity, and we are, according to conservative estimates, the 12th largest emitter of carbon emissions worldwide, which is a hell of a lot of carbon for an economy as small as ours when ranked against global economy size. But South Africa is taking action, at least on a policy basis. We've pledged to be a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which we ratified in 2019. And the specific pledge in the Paris Agreement is that we will, between 2020 and 2025, adopt a declining emissions trajectory, and after that, a stable trajectory emission. After that, we will decline our emissions. It's 2022, 2025 is very, very close by. In order to achieve this, in terms of implementation, the country aims to transition to an inclusive green economy, combining the goals of economic development, social progress, and environmental preservation. This policy shift has already been practically put into operation with the establishment of the National Climate Commission and also the draft National Climate Change Bill, which has been introduced in Parliament this year. If I may just talk briefly about the bill, it will come up for public participation, probably repeatedly in the next few years. And what the bill primarily does, as far as industry is concerned, is set sectoral emission targets for industries per sector, and then also assigns carbon budgets. And it seems the long-term plan for the implementation of the climate change bill, in conjunction with the existing carbon tax, is that if companies stick to their carbon budgets and therefore their sectoral emission targets, they will not need to pay carbon tax, or carbon tax will be recalculated on basis of how budgets are adhered to or not. So for anyone listening and for all participating, keep an eye out and for the Government Gazette. All public in South Africa has the right to make their comments on these types of legislation as they pass through Parliament. But in terms of our legacy of being an economy driven by traditional linear carbon-intensive industry, the move toward targeting the transition to an inclusive green economy and its translation into public policy signifies a massive and very disruptive shift. And you know that it's massive and disruptive because of the amount of resistance received. We know it isn't easy, and we know that it seems to be unexpected, even though my colleague at National Treasury, Charlene Hemraj, is very quick to say that they've only been working on introducing carbon tax for 10 years. So she was very surprised when nobody was ready. So in the long-term transition, it's planned to bring about multiple benefits in the form of stronger, more resilient growth, more agile growth, increased competitiveness, and I'll get to that later, and higher and better employment. I think in terms of that, we know what the issues are with the just transition and the job losses that are certain from the transition away from coal-fired power, and the traditional economies that have been built up around, especially in Mpumalanga, around power stations and coal mining. And the promise of green jobs is not an absolute increase, but that more jobs will be created than will be lost. So it's not promising that nothing will be lost, but it's just the potential to create more than is lost. So the move from the linear economy model, the take, make, and dispose, to a circular-based model, but based on principles of designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible, and regenerating natural systems and giving natural systems a chance to regenerate while we halt pulling more and more raw materials out. So it's very much a model in which the environmental and the social concerns are weighed similarly with profit. And that's very new for the world, and it's very new for South Africa. Okay, so From the perspective of the SDGs, I know that UNIDO is very big on the SDGs, and so are we. Bringing together, I think, what we've pulled together of the SDGs, SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 9 would be infrastructure, industry, and innovation. Uh, but it's very, very clear that gender equality is intertwined with the sustainable development as reflected in those goals. The transition from a linear to a circular economy needs to be inclusive and collaborative, and I think that's come through very clearly from the way that those goals have been integrated through the national framework and eventually finding expression in national and departmental goals and outcomes. Um, for its part, the DTI has, in collaboration with UNIDO and UN Women, from a project started in 2019, produced the Economic Empowerment of Women in Green Industry assessment report. The report was published in 2021 and was welcomed as an important step towards developing a coherent and coordinated policy and implementation framework, not just for the department, but I think it was jointly helmed by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition and the Department of Women. And I believe work has been ongoing on the work plan that was arrived at out of that project. The data collected from that project, so data is a massive issue in this area. The data collected from the survey conducted for that project really provides a good basis for what the opportunities, the constraints, the possible measures are to increase women's leadership and participation in green industry and green entrepreneurship. And it forms a useful evidence base and fills some gaps in terms of what we didn't know about what women's challenges are and what opportunities they see for themselves in the new green industries. Actually, one of the interesting things was when we compared the study to some of the others in other sectors, there's a lot more optimism among women in green industries because they feel that because it's a new industry, there isn't so much of an established male-dominated role. There's lots of room to establish something new, including women from the beginning. So it's that idea of building back better, new economies. So I think after COVID, we're all in that state where we have an opportunity to rebuild the world, to rebuild economies, to rebuild systems of production and consumption, and we need to try to build back better. But that gives us an advantage. If we're building something new, we might as well build it right the first time. And in terms of DTIC's current strategic direction, as expressed in our annual performance plan, I know my principal, Gerard Fourie, mentioned this yesterday, but he mentioned it in terms of hard industrial sectors. I will go to the other side and talk to the joint KPIs on transformation. So that's how that usually appears in government documents, but transformation would obviously include gender representation and diversity, and the development of that throughout the department and throughout the sectors that it represents. So that covers the global picture and also the government's views on the introduction of transformation, how it should be handled. But the private sector should also carefully evaluate the opportunity cost of a sustainable and socially responsible path. The costs to transform traditional business needs to a new path should be weighed against the costs of doing nothing. So we understand that it's not cheap. We understand it doesn't cost nothing to transfer into an entirely new paradigm of thinking, but we certainly at Green Industries believe that the costs of inaction will be much greater over the medium to long term to businesses who do not adapt or do not begin to think about how they will adapt. So in terms of carbon emissions, I'll go to the green side first and then move on to the gender mainstreaming part. Carbon emissions are being integrated as a quantified factor of production. And to some extent, so is gender diversity, and I'll show you how when I bring up the slides. But carbon emissions are becoming every bit as integral to the cost of doing business and the conditions of doing business as the cost of materials, inputs, labor, um, and the carbon taxes make that quite obvious. They literally add a cost penalty to being above a certain carbon threshold. Um, so that's really changed the game. So in terms of how it's been quantified and the fact that it's come in terms of pricing and in terms of access, um, 10 years ago it was to be green, to be a hippie, but that's really not where we're at anymore. Now it's the bottom line. It's affecting um, companies' capitalization, their access to funding, to markets, and also their actual balance sheets. Um, Gender diversity is also becoming a key consideration in a new breed of investment products, and evidence is mounting that says and proves, rather empirically, that when women serve as leaders and employees of companies, businesses benefit, and company diversity and performance improves. Several recent studies, and I'll pick on two because they are the largest and widest ranging. The McKinsey study and the Catalyst study. So the McKinsey study studied over 1,000 companies, over 12 countries. So it's the largest that I'm aware of that's been done to look at this particular research issue. And it's basically correlated for the first time in a quantifiable way what including women and gender perspectives in planning at all levels of company management and outputs can do for the bottom line. So it's not something we do because we want to feel good, it's something we do because we want to make money. So, and environmental sustainability and social responsibility have come together in a framework called the ESG framework. And this used to be what was known in South Africa as corporate social responsibility. That's what it was when I was still studying. But it's a real evolution of that concept. And even though there is some criticism of how it's currently being implemented, it's still a very new framework, and the robustness in its credibility and its verifiability, I believe, will come along with time. But I think what's core now is that companies begin to look at the framework, at the requirements of each. So in terms of environment, let's take them one by one. You're looking at companies' responses to climate change, to their greenhouse gas emissions, to the resource depletion that come as a result of their operations, to the water depletion or pollution that might come as a result of operations, to water and waste and energy efficiency, to potential for degradation via deforestation, for their impacts on biodiversity. So those are some of the things that they might consider under the environmental banner. Under social, we're looking at factors like working conditions, equal opportunities and employee diversity from a gender lens, philanthropy, health and safety of employees, and community engagement. There are some also real no-nos on that list. Some of them are actively illegal, matters like child labor and so on. And then under the governance side, again, we see the gender diversity aspect bring in, but that's more related to representation at senior executive and board level, and also at CEO level, executive pay, business ethics, public lobbying and donations, and also tax strategy. So that's looking at the extent to which the company attempts to dodge its tax responsibilities in its current territory and tries to move it to a friendlier jurisdiction. So why would a company be interested in this? Why would anybody bother? Because unfortunately ESG funds, and I'm talking about capital that is now mediated by adherence to ESG principles, specifically in the US market in the last year, seen inflows of over $22 billion worth of this funding. That's 3 times higher than the exchange-traded funds that were on the market in 2019, and this is specific to ESG. the extreme shift in Europe is even more marked. In Europe, assets in passive funds tracking ESG type indices and ETFs, are exchange traded funds. Those grew from 59 billion to 174 billion in the last year. So there is a significant amount. So all companies need capital. All companies need to loan. All companies need access to banks and markets. And banks and markets are saying all companies need to adhere to ESG principles. One of the interesting things that one of the analysts said in one of the articles I read was it seems that the millennial generation is really taking a stand for a new set of values, because 2021 is the year, according to the metric of determination, when the first millennials turn 40. When the first millennials, yeah, when the first group of millennials turn 40, and when they have the point at which essentially they have developed enough financial clout in order to be a significant force on the aggregate investment picture. So it seems that they're putting their money where their values are. Recently in South Africa, we've seen the introduction of, and I'll bring it up in a second, the Old Mutual released its first platform in South Africa to publish ESG ratings for local unit trusts. Just need to bring that up. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yes. The Satrix has recently also listed an inclusion and diversity exchange traded fund, which tracks JSE listed companies that meet the specific sets of ESG criteria, including diversity, inclusion, people development. The Signia has a new ETRIX ETF, investing global securities, meeting sustainability criteria. And those are also tracking JSE, tracking global or emerging market companies. And then FNB has launched their social responsibility exchange traded note, not exchange traded fund, ETN. And that provides also exposure to the what's called the Carbon Select Issuer Capped Index. And the index invests in global companies that have that have low carbon exposure and high ESG performance. Just in the last 2 months, the MTN Group actually made pretty big news, even though I'm not sure that it reached the news bulletin. It's pretty big news to me because it's a significant landmark move from a South African company. The MTN Group is the 13th most valuable stock on the JSE with a market cap of 307 billion rand. And it set itself the global goal, the goal of cutting its emissions to zero by 2040, and has taken the step of linking the pay of senior executives to those goals. So they've set goals for environmental, social, and government. So the environmental would be the carbon emission goal. They've set the elements of executive compensation for short-term incentives and long-term incentives. That means this year's bonuses and 5 years bonuses to depend on progress in these ESG goals. And in addition to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions, they've also set the goal of enhancing diversity and inclusion and extending rural broadband. That would be that community aspect and increasing all South Africans' access to the information that is so crucial to participating in the economy these days. So in the latest sustainability report, they are more specific on the gender side, and they state that they're aiming to create a gender equal workforce by 2030, and noting that they want to act on gender pay parity in a meaningful way. Now, why would NTN do this? This is a lot of cost. What are they planning to get out of this? Well, just a few months ago on the Financial Times stock exchange, the Russell Index, they upgraded MTN's overall rating to 4.3. That's in the end of December 2021. from 2.9 previously. And this means that MTN is now from the 34th percentile on that particular rating system to the 97th percentile. And every percentile that you improve gives you access to a larger chunk of global capital. So there's a very good reason why companies at a global corporate industrial level should want to improve their environmental performance, improve their governance, improve their social and gender representation. Here's a list of the Old Mutual ESG fund rankings, and you'll see that they have various categorizations. I don't have I couldn't fit in the actual scale, it's right at the bottom, but it suffices to say that green is good. Green is a company that is funds that are advancing and have good ESG scores, and average is just paying attention, just looking into it. And the red is highlighting what they're calling on their index laggards. So there is real public policy clout behind gender mainstreaming and the climate response, but there are real business reasons why all companies should look into applying the gender lens to how they plan, to how they manage, to how they employ, and making sure that they are representative of the world that they are wanting to sell to, that they're wanting to lend from. So in terms of the ESG rules, one of the criticisms that there is often leveled at this very young framework is that it's lip service, it's greenwashing. It doesn't really look at the real outcomes of what these companies produce, and that might be true for the moment, but we're only beginning, and all systems have to start looking at criteria and then get into a deeper understanding and deeper veracity at looking at whether those criteria are being adhered to. And in terms of this, the EU made a first step in 2021 to enforce rules to regulate the sustainable finance industry. So they're now looking at a framework to regulate where fund managers claim to invest in line with ESG considerations, looking to have to publish tangible and measurable plans of the processes that were used to arrive at the ESG criteria compliance, and they have to meet industry best practice. So those rules are known as the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and it's a positive move in terms of increasing the veracity and the move away from us believing that the system is merely greenwashing. At the last NCPC conference, which was in 2019, we skipped a year, I introduced the ESG framework, which was then just theoretical. And we were talking at that time about the peer recognition network and the need for vetting of carbon emissions. And at that time, I was dismissed. It was, that's never going to happen. There were people who said that carbon tax was never going to happen. I mean, I think we need to know that there is real impetus behind these changes. Government is serious. Business, if they're not serious, ought to be serious. And it made me think of, Ndee actually mentioned the lady who from DTIC initially was given the responsibility of oversight for the NCPC in 2002. Her name is Marba Fasahi. And at the time at the DTI, Gerard thought she was crazy. And now he's been managing this program and is a voracious advocate for green economy and resource efficiency wherever he goes. So we all have to start off a little bit crazy and build from there. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ilze. I think in the interest of time, perhaps what we should do is to take the questions at the end of the session just before lunch. and then go into the second session with the questions. The essence, I think, of the message that Ilze had was that last sentence where she said government is serious and business should be serious. So part of what we would like to get out of this session today, or the two sessions, is that we would like to share the resources that we are talking about so that we can all support by going, for instance, to the framework, going to the economic empowerment of women in green industry or green economy, to the information that the reports and the framework, so that people can actually understand what's going to be expected of them, but also understand what the support is that is available to help them. Because what we are also finding is this gap that Ilze referred to between ambition and action. And there are a lot of good intentions, but in many cases there are also a situation where organizations, government organizations as well as corporates, do not know where to start, and that, or how to really progress on this path. And that's part of what we would like to support. Start by a drop in the ocean today and see what we can practically do in order to support this.